Welcome back to The Income Generation. I'm here today with Dan Gardner, author of the books Science of Fear and Future Babble, and also an expert in the field of human psychology. Dan, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Tell us, what role does psychology play in the financial decisions of people?
Well, it's absolutely fundamental to every human decision. People think that if you ask them about their thinking, how did you make this decision? How did you decide to invest in this or not to invest in that, or whatever the decision may be? They think that their thoughts consist of what they can come up with consciously. It's the information that they thought about, and they thought about rationally, and they came to a rational decision. But that's an illusion. There's so much more going on in our decision-making than that. And that's the role of psychology. And one of the central insights of psychology is that vast numbers of unconscious thought processes are at work all the time in our decision-making, and they are extremely influential in our decision-making, much more influential than we tend to think.
So I have a financial advisory practice, and I still work with individual clients virtually every day. And what would you say to my client that comes in who is the engineer or the actuary or the accountant who denies this, who says, my decisions, I spreadsheet everything, I make very logical decisions, I do my Ben Franklin, and then I act based upon what makes the most sense? What would you say to that person?
I would suggest that there is an entire field of science that suggests you are wrong. That can be difficult to accept. But if we're going to be as rational about it as you claim to be, you have to recognize that when there is a veritable mountain of science suggesting that human beings actually are influenced by, as I say, unconscious thought processes, that they are not as rational decision makers that they think they are, they tend to think that they are, that you have to actually respect that science. By the way, one of the insights of psychology is something called, quite memorably, bias, which is when you explain to people that there are psychological biases involved in decision-making that can skew their decision-making, they tend to understand that and accept that in regards to other people, right? But in regard to me, oh, no. I, uniquely to the human species, see things objectively and decide purely rationally. That's bias. And it's a very, very difficult thing to overcome. But the best decision makers do overcome it. One of my favorite examples of this is George Soros. Of course, he's politically controversial now, but if you look at his record as an investor through the 60s and 70s and 1980s, he had this amazing record and the gains to prove it. And when George Soros was asked, as he was so often, George, why are you so good? He always gave exactly the same answer. He said, basically, I know that I am fallible. I know that people make mistakes. And I know that I will make mistakes. And therefore, I think more carefully about my decision making, and I'm more likely to catch and correct my mistakes than are others.
So to some degree, it sounds like you're saying that just acknowledging this, just someone understanding that their decisions are made emotionally and then justified logically, is the first step toward helping them make better decisions. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I'm a big advocate of Psychology 101. Anybody who is making important decisions about their future, and that's pretty much all of us, really should understand the basics of human psychology. But there's a trick here. If you understand Psychology 101, you may conclude, that's it, I'm bulletproof. I've got it all down. I know about the psychological biases, therefore I will not be tripped up by them. That is a danger, and it's a mistake. In fact, the great psychologist, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist who is the giant in this field, Daniel Kahneman, he has spent his lifetime studying these psychological biases, and he frankly admits that he too gets tripped up by them from time to time. You cannot simply say, I am aware of the problem, therefore the problem doesn't apply to me. It always applies to you. And that's why you need to constantly examine your decision-making, constantly monitor for the mistakes.
Now, I'm suffering from bias right now because this entire show is about this very topic. And I so far agree with 110% of everything that you've said. In fact, I even gave a real life example in my own life of how that was a hard-won lesson. For our viewers, though, tell us where do you think this has a greater effect on decisions to buy certain investments or on decisions to sell certain investments, if there's any difference at all?
I don't think that there's necessarily a difference.
Okay.
We can make mistakes in any field. We can make mistakes of any variety. But when it comes to buying and selling, it depends upon the particular individual and particular individual circumstances. But people tend to be cognitive conservatives, which is to say that once they make a decision, they tend not to adjust that decision in light of new evidence as much as they should. So if you decide, I'm going to buy this stock, I think it's going to be a winner, and then you start to get new information which suggests, no, it's actually not a winner, people will tend to stick with the stock too long, which is to say you're not adjusting, you're not selling as enough. But there's a big caveat to that, because there are other folks, particularly day traders, high volume traders, they actually get into the opposite mistake, which is basically that they're constantly churning and constantly changing the decision and buying and selling and buying and selling and buying and selling. And they're doing that because they have no commitment to their decisions. And so because they're not actually really believing that, this stock is a winner if I hang on to it long enough. And so there's no commitment, and so they're too free and easy when it comes to the decision. Okay, I'm going to sell it, off it goes. So there are opposite problems there. Generally, if we're talking generally about the species, the problem tends to be that we're too cognitively conservative. We don't change our minds enough. But we always have to be aware that there's also an opposite problem.
So for all the husbands watching the show right now, as our wives already know, I think what Dan's saying is we absolutely just don't want to admit that we're wrong and made a mistake in the first place. So we've got to take a quick commercial break right now, but stay with us. We'll continue this very intriguing interview with Dan Gardner as soon as we're back. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm here today with Dan Gardner. Dan, tell us about this brain science that you refer to in the science of fear.
Yeah, well, that's basically the science of the psychology of decision making, which is to go back to Daniel Kahneman, system 1 and system 2, to use his terms, which is basically system 1, or rather system 2, is the system of thought which we are consciously aware of. And so when I say to you, how did you make this decision? And you say, well, I thought about this fact and that fact, and I came up with that conclusion. That's system 2. But system 1 is called system 1 because it actually typically comes before system 2 in our decision making. It's all those thought processes that we're not aware of. And they happen quickly. They deliver judgments in the form of intuitions, hunches, and they come to us instantaneously. And typically at that point, our conscious mind sort of takes a look at what the unconscious mind has come up with, and it can adjust it. It can say that's completely bonkers and overrule it. But typically what happens is that the conscious mind does not get involved to the extent that it should. And that's what makes the unconscious thought processes so influential. Basically, we're a bit lazy. Conscious thought, really looking at our feelings. When we have a strong sense that something is true, we tend not to bring conscious thought to bear and examine that feeling and ask ourselves if it really makes sense. We tend to be a little bit lazy in that regard. That's what makes system 1 so influential in our decision making.
So it sounds like to some degree it's human nature. We look for the easy button. If we feel confident, we don't look any further. We accept it as being true and we move on.
That's exactly right. And that's very clear. There's abundant evidence to indicate that when we have a strong intuition, we'll likely just go with that. And there are all sorts of other ways in which we tend to take cognitive shortcuts. So, for example, something called attribute substitution. If I ask you a question that's important for a forecast or for an investment, and the question is difficult, you will, consciously or not, you'll adjust it slightly to come to a related question that feels intuitively easy to answer. And then you'll answer that intuitively easy question, and you'll feel that you answered the first question, but you didn't really answer the first question. You answered the second question, which isn't quite the same. And that happens all the time. And when we look at good decision makers, good investors, what you find time and again is that they're very precise, very careful, and they don't fool themselves. They don't get diverted in that way.
Now, Dan, you talk about this a bit in your book, Super Forecasting. Tell us more about how this psychology actually can help somebody looking forward in attempts to forecast things.
Yeah. Well, super forecasting, the title comes from an enormous research program undertaken by my co-author, Phil Tetlock, who's a very eminent psychologist at Wharton, and one of the leading researchers in the field of forecasting. And over the course of 4 years, in a intelligence community sponsored tournament, Phil had thousands of volunteers. In fact, over the course of 4 years, more than 20,000 volunteers were involved. And they made forecasts about big, important geopolitical and economic events, like will Greece default? How will China's GDP do in the fourth quarter? That sort of thing. Big, difficult questions. And at the end of the 4 years, with so many people making so many forecasts, they were able to figure out that there was a very small number of people who had excellent forecasting skill. And they were consistently excellent, which tells you you're looking mostly at skill, not luck. And so then the question is, well, what is it about them that makes them so good? Well, after what I've just discussed about the importance of catching and correcting your psychologically induced mistakes, you won't be surprised to hear that one of the very first things that's so important about these super forecasters is that they are slow, cautious, careful, rigorous thinkers. The people who they have an immediate, strong sense that they have of what the answer is, and they're fixed, they're determined. Maybe they go out and get some new information to support that belief, but they stick with that, and ultimately that's their final answer. That's what most people tend to do. That's what our psychology impels us to do. These super forecasters do exactly the opposite. They basically set that initial intuitive response aside, and then they look exactly at the forecasting question. They break it down very carefully. They break it down and say, how can I possibly answer this? How do I research the problem? What are the information components that I need? And then they proceed step by methodical step. It's a very slow, painful, rigorous, demanding process, but it works. And what's interesting is when you look at how super forecasters make their forecasts, which are demonstrably excellent. I mentioned George Soros earlier in the interview. If you know the writing of George Soros, it's very, very similar. Basically, George Soros, I'm sure that if he had competed in this tournament, he too would have been a super forecaster.
So what you're saying in a word is just say no to data mining. Fight the urge to data mine and look for data that supports what you hope is true. Dan, we have to wrap up today, but it's been a real pleasure. I thank you so much for adding value today on the show.
Thank you so much.
And for our viewers, stay with us. We're going to go with Morgan, a one-on-one with myself and Morgan as soon as we get back. And we're going to talk more about the psychology of investing and the things that you need to be aware of in order to make the best financial decisions for your own personal situation. We'll be right back.